Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
This is a republished episode of the conversation I had with Jason Staples about his book, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. I had the privilege of talking to Jason about this book before it came out, and it is now out for sale on Amazon and wherever you might buy books. So I would highly encourage you to go check this book out. Again, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. And I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Jason about his groundbreaking new book. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So just a little bit about Jason. He is the assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at NC State University. He's the author of two books, The Idea of Israel in Second Temple Judaism, published with Cambridge University Press in 2021, and Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, which will come out next year, also with Cambridge University Press. And that's what we're going to be talking about primarily today. He has also worked in sports media for 15 years, used to coach football, and does voiceover work to ensure his family can survive. And he will be launching the BiblePod podcast in the next few months. So I am very excited about this conversation. So, you know, we're doing this series on key terms in Paul, and I really feel like much more at home with every other one of these terms, faith, righteousness, law, and I'm Messiah. I've done, my own until I work on it. But Israel is one that I just didn't know anything about. I read your first book. And honestly, it seems like everyone is kind of like that. Because this term has kind of been ignored or assumed. We've all assumed that we know what it means. So what is your basic argument about what Israel means, just for someone that, doesn't know anything about this whole discussion?
Yeah, and you're right that generally speaking, the part of the problem has been that most folks have just assumed that we know. And when I started, I kind of did the same thing, that you assume that you know what these terms mean, and nearly all modern scholarship has assumed that Israel in the Second Temple period, that when you hear someone say Israel, you read Israel on the page, that is synonymous with the Jews. And that, seems pretty natural that would be the case. And by Jews, I mean, in Greek, Yehudioi, or Hebrew, Yehudim. And, that there's another more or less synonymous term, Hebrews, that also applies there. And so you've tended to, have biblical scholars. You read a lot of work in biblical scholarship over the past couple centuries, and Israel and Israelites and Jews, or Israel and the Jews, are used interchangeably. In the sense of, you have a lot of scholars that interchange those terms for style because they don't want to repeat themselves over and over again. And then that's led to some, I think, interpretive problems, because once you actually take a really close look at the evidence, you find out that there are some differences in the way that these terms are used, and that they're not used. If they were exactly synonymous, you'd expect their distribution across the literature to be more or less even. That you'd see, some interchangeable use, like what you see in biblical scholarship. But that's not the case. And the conclusion of my first book was that the term Jews, or Jew as a singular, that Jews are a subset of the supercategory of Israel, specifically the subset that's derived from the southern kingdom of Judah, which is, of course, where Jew or Yehudioi or Yehudim, those terms come from Judah. And it turns out that the way that term is used throughout the Second Temple period, it consistently means something like Judahite. It's just Judahite. So when you say Jew in the Second Temple period, you're referring to people from Judah, or Judea as it comes into Latin. So you have a bit of a distinction there, because Israel then is that larger category that includes those associated with and descended from the northern kingdom of Israel who are not from Judah. So Judah, by the way, can of course include the traditional southern tribes. So it's not just from the tribe of Judah. That makes it even more confusing, because you can have someone from Benjamin who's also a Jew, like Paul, right? He's from the group that's traditionally associated with the kingdom of Judah, but he's a Benjaminite. So on the other hand, though, Israel includes those who are from the northern kingdom and not associated with the southern kingdom of Judah. And ultimately, that means that by definition, there are non-Jewish Israelites. Some of Israel is not Jewish, and that's pretty much always the case, going all the way back into the biblical period. In fact, when you get to First and Second Kings, Israel is always the northern kingdom, and over and against the kingdom of Judah. And so, those tribes, when you're talking about Israelites after the destruction, or after the division between the kingdoms, when you're talking about Israelites, you're talking about non-Jews. You're talking about not people not from Judah. It only gets a little more complicated once the kingdom of Israel stops existing as its own entity, and Judah starts to try to lay claim to the rule over that previous area of Israel, and to sort of subsume larger Israel under their authority. But still, you don't see Judah identified with Israel throughout. It's still Judah as prime tribe within Israel, and that carries through the Second Temple period. And then Hebrew, of course, I only touch on a little bit, but Hebrew is in the Second Temple period. I mean, First Temple period, there's lots of theories on what that may have actually derived from, but in the Second Temple period, it's consistently treated as a linguistic term. So you have, Hebraioi are over and against Hellenes. They're the people who are not Greek speakers; they're Hebrew speakers. Whether that means Hebrew or Aramaic is another question. But basically, Semitic speakers. And those Semitic speakers may or may not be Jewish. They may be Samaritan, and that the Samaritans are, of course, your prime example of a group of people who are not Jews, who do not claim to be Jews, who Jews do not identify as Jews, who claim to be Israel, or to claim to be Israelites, descended from northern tribes. And, there's some Jews who, call into question whether or not they're really Israelites, or whether they're, some Israelites who intermarried with the nations that were scattered there by Assyria, and therefore they're disqualified from being truly Israelites, since the Holy Seed has been adulterated in some way. But still, they're claiming to be Israel and not Judah, and so that is that's an important distinction. And for me, once we recognize that distinction, a lot of texts start to make a lot more sense. And I think Paul is perhaps the one that this distinction, it ends up mattering the most, because of a lot of the things that he does with Jews and Gentiles, and then Israel, and all of these discussions about how this all works in light of the Messiah. And essentially, my argument in the first book is that there's a large strand of restoration eschatology in which Jews are consistently expecting God to restore the whole people of Israel. That is, all 12 people from all 12 tribes, including both Jews, that is, those from Judah, and the non-Jewish Israelites from the other tribes from the northern kingdom of Israel, most of whom are understood as having been scattered among the nations, and they're out there in some fashion. And then there's some debate and dispute on how exactly that's going to happen. There's some who question whether it's going to happen, but in any case, that's a live conversation in the Second Temple period about Israel's restoration, which is more than just like Jewish independence or, Jewish rule over the nations or whatnot. It has to involve these non-Jewish Israelites in order for it to be the fulfillment of the prophecies that these Jewish thinkers are actually expecting.
Yeah. So I feel like that really catches us up to speed on first book, right? I mean, obviously you've written, 400 pages on it, and there's a little bit more to it, but the basic idea, and honestly, when I read it, I said, oh, duh, right? I mean, it is a kind of like, why hadn't I thought of that? But this is really obvious, right? That these two terms refer to different people because that's just what they are in the Bible, right? I mean, it's just like in the Bible, there's a tribe of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel. I mean, it's in it, and then it's like, well, why in the Second Temple period would they just like, that distinction would just evaporate, right? I mean, it actually doesn't make, any sense that it would. But you're right, that when we come to Paul, and it's especially scholarship about Paul, it's like, it's totally synonymous. And people have, that's what people have said, right? And people have, just not paid enough attention, I think, even to the term Israel. I mean, when you just look for the term Israel in Paul, like why he doesn't start with the term Israel until Romans 9, right? In Romans. And it's like, why? If it's, again, the distribution is just is rather striking. So just talking about Paul here. So under your view, you alluded to this. What is the basic problem Paul is trying to solve? And so you talked about this, restoration of Israel, right? The reunification of the 12 tribes. What is Paul wrestling with this idea of, okay, we have Jews, we still need Israel, right? Is that the basic issue for Paul?
I think that's part of it. I think there's a little more to it than that, but I think that's a big part of it. And by the way, you mentioned, the response being, duh, this is obvious. I think actually that's my, you kind of have to identify what sets you apart as a scholar, whatnot. My scholarly superpower is that I'm too simple to, accept certain things. And I just keep asking why. And I find these obvious things and then discover that like, oh, wow. And it shouldn't take 400 pages to demonstrate this sort of thing. But it turns out that, you can say the obvious thing, but then you actually have to defend it. And that's the hard part. So that's what that's
especially
about.
When everyone else is denying the obvious thing.
Right. That's the hard part. So yeah, I've spent, 20 years on this project now and I'm ready to be done with this one obvious thing that I've been working on for 20 years. But yeah, I think, for Paul, I think the basic problem boils down to this. And that is, if Jesus is Israel's Messiah, which I think it's pretty obvious that that's what Paul thinks. He explicitly says this. So if Jesus is the Messiah, then, well, the Messiah is supposed to be associated with the restoration of Israel that we were just talking about, right? So, okay, this is a bit of a problem. If Jesus is the Messiah, where is this restoration that was promised? And beyond that, so where is Israel's restoration, which has to involve essentially a few things? All 12 tribes, an internal transformation so that Israel is going to be obedient. This is the whole notion of the new covenant in Jeremiah. You get the new heart, new spirit in Ezekiel, and so on. Because Israel, again, the idea is that Israel was exiled and scattered because of disobedience. If they're not made obedient when they're restored, it's just going to happen again. So the final restoration is going to involve a transformation to be a just people who obey God. It's going to involve all 12 tribes, and it's going to involve a reunification and return in some way. I think he does have some sort of land expectation, although it's minimal in the letters. The question is, okay, if Jesus has initiated this, and Paul thinks he has, that doesn't look like it's happening. So then you have the additional problem of these Gentiles, uncircumcised men, receiving the Spirit, which was promised to Israel as part of the restoration. And so if you're in Paul's shoes, you're looking around and going, okay, expecting the restoration, not seeing exactly what I might expect, and then I'm seeing this. Okay, so what does this have to do with this, and how am I going to explain this? So actually, if I were going to summarize the problem in one line that Paul, I think, is wrestling with, it's actually what I think is the thesis statement of the book of Acts, which is, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? And Paul is trying to explain and also, work through himself what this restoration of the kingdom to Israel looks like. And as in Acts, Acts, I think, makes a similar case. He's a second generation Pauline Christian. who's writing this, he argues that, well, the restoration of Israel has to involve the Gentiles somehow. I think Paul ultimately comes to that conclusion, and Acts builds on that and so on. But Paul's that's the question. That's the problem that he's dealing with, is if Jesus is the Messiah, what is going on with these Gentiles receiving the promise to Israel, and where is Israel in all of this? So I think that's basically what it boils down to.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, again, it is, when you put it in the, them expecting to be restored, right? It is again, one of those things where you read the prophets and you're like, oh, of course, right? Of course that they're expecting this, right? But for whatever reason, we just don't read Paul and the prophets together or something. I mean, those two sort of ideas just haven't really, they're just not so as central. I mean, people are starting to do it more.
I think there's actually a part of the problem here is the history of biblical scholarship. You have to remember a lot of professional academic biblical scholarship came out of a Protestant context in which the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was more or less de-emphasized. And Paul was understood as essentially proclaiming not quite a Marcionite gospel, but something not far from it. And you look at a lot of the old German scholars on Paul from the 19th century, and you're going to find that it's an intentional thing that they're not reading the prophets in Paul. Like, it's a willful thing. And then the way that scholarship works is we all get trained, and you know this as well as anybody, right? We all get trained in the scholarship, right? We're introduced to the discussions that came before us. And so, I have to learn F.C. Bauer and what F.C. Bauer said, and then I'm responding to Bauer, and all scholarship is iterative, and it builds on what came before. Well, if what came before is already resting on some really problematic assumptions, then it takes some significant paradigm shifts to actually re-examine those foundational things that we're not trained to question, because that's part of the discourse that we're trained into. So I think I've been frankly shocked at times when I've talked to some other biblical scholars, other scholars of Paul, and I'll mention something from, say, Deuteronomy or the prophets, and I get a blank look. They're not familiar with that passage, because again, the other thing is, we all tend to be trained in a silo, and this is more the case for certain New Testament programs where it's not a broad program where you're getting, early Judaism, Hebrew Bible, larger context, and then maybe you focus on one thing. You're doing New Testament, and you don't really learn other things. And so a lot of Pauline scholarship is very myopic and insular, in that you're trying to do close readings of Paul. And I've been surprised by some folks, some of our colleagues who don't actually know other portions of the Bible and things that Paul would have had second nature. They don't know that all that well. And then that also leads to questions of, would Paul have really expected, his audience to know like Ezekiel that well? Come on, he couldn't be like this subtle about that. And then you read First Clement and you go, yeah, maybe his audience was actually that sophisticated, at least some of them. So, the author of Acts is certainly sophisticated enough to do that. So this again gets into some of those problems within the guild that we have to, if we're going to do good work, we have to understand that, some of the very roots of the guild aren't helpful for us.
Well, and I think that really is the, just in scholarship in general, those are the kinds of things that end up being the foundation, right? Is when people question the very basic things, right? That was E.P. Sanders' work. It was like, okay, let's go back and look at this again, right? Even though everyone's assumed this, right? What was Judaism really like? And that kind of question, right, is really, the kind of like groundbreaking question.
It turns out that these German scholars from the 19th century these German New Testament scholars didn't really understand Judaism. That's Paul and Palestinian Judaism right there. These 19th century German scholars didn't really understand Judaism, and we've all been building on them. So maybe we should reevaluate that. And turns out there's a lot more meat left on that bone.
Right. So let's I read through about half, maybe 2/3 of your book, the new one. So I got the privilege of a sneak peek at some of these things. So one of the striking things is that you basically ignore Romans 3-8, and you have very detailed exegesis of Romans 1 to 9-11. I think you have like 2 pages on Romans 3-8. It's like, okay, well, I should say something about these texts, since literally truckloads of volumes have been written on it. But I think what's really helpful actually is these are texts that have been glossed over or ignored, right? Or just said, okay, like Paul didn't write this, or anything we can do to not interpret the text has been done. So what I would like to do is just kind of go through Romans 2 and some of your points on the exegetical points. So because that I think really is the strength of your work, both in the Israel book and the Paul book. You're reading the text carefully and closely, and that's actually what has to be done, right? For any of these things, at the end of the day, it's just what does the text say, and being a careful reader of that text is just so important. I think you do a great job of that. So let's just start with Romans 2. So first of all, why have people just brush Romans 2 under the rug, and how have people dealt with it in general? How have they gotten rid of Romans 2, and why?
Yeah. So, and actually, getting to why I basically didn't do much in 3 through 8, like you said, those are the ones that everybody there's been a ton written on, and there's a lot of confidence about what those mean. But then you've got Romans 1 and 2 and 9-11, which of course are the frames for those central chapters, that then once the traditional readings of 3 through 8 are in place, people look back at 1 and 2 and 9-11 and they're like, this doesn't really fit very well. And my approach to this was, I've always thought of doing Pauline exegesis as sort of like putting together a puzzle. And, my thought is, if you finish the puzzle and there are certain pieces that are still on the table, and, they like you wind up, you've got this picture put together and you're like, okay, I got it done. Why are there these 5 pieces over here? Well, I guess those just weren't part of the puzzle. Like, they came in the box. So my thought is, okay, look, we've got this puzzle put together and there are these pieces that lots of people just leave there and they say, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's a later interpolation, or maybe Paul's just talking about maybe Paul's talking in the voice of his enemies here or something, because this clearly can't, cohere with what we've got elsewhere. My thought is, maybe the problem is we put the puzzle together wrongly, and that's why these pieces don't fit. And so what I tried to do is I actually went out of my way to go to some of the most difficult, the passages that everybody kind of throws their hands up in the air and says, well, I don't really know what this means, and, because this doesn't really fit. Okay, I'm going to do those passages, and I'm going to show how those passages actually make sense. And once we get the foundation of those passages and those pieces are put in place on the table, some of these other things like Romans 3 through 8 are going to go in different spots in that puzzle, and I think it'll fit together much better. But if I was going to do 3 through 8, this book would have been 1,200 pages, or more, especially given how much has been written on those. So for my money, my hope is that someone will come along and, build on the foundation of some of these more difficult passages and say, oh, that makes more sense of this in Romans 4 now. That's kind of the hope. But anyway, when we get to Romans 2, as you said, this has been a passage, I think Klein Snodgrass is the one that said more time has been spent explaining the text away than explaining it in Romans 2. Like, well, I mean, clearly, this is what it says, but Paul doesn't really mean that. And you've got, different right. explanations ranging from, E.P. Sanders actually leaves Romans 2 to an appendix in Paul, the Law, and the Jewish People, because he says, what's the quote? The treatment of the law in chapter 2 cannot be harmonized with any of the diverse things which Paul says about the law elsewhere. Which to me is a little surprising, because this is how he leads into the discussion about the law, about the Torah in Romans. So if it's that out of bounds, like that seems like either he's the most incoherent and awful introducer of his arguments, or maybe we've not got what he said about the law right in some of those other places. So yeah, the main problem there is that Sanders basically says, the problem with Romans 2 is that it does not naturally lead up to the conclusion that no one keeps the law, much less that the law cannot be kept. And instead, Romans 2 argues that the Torah, the law, can and must be kept. So if that's the case, then how do we get to, according to the Torah, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and so on. So, this is why Stan Stowers said interpreters have typically flown over Romans 2 at high speed and high altitude to get to their landing spot in Romans 3, where they can start doing their work. And my take is, I think we need to read this very seriously as something that Paul probably thinks. Of course, you've got Douglas Campbell and some folks following him on this. He's basically developed out of the Sanders. I mean, Campbell's very much a close reader of Sanders. And where Sanders said this doesn't fit Paul in Paul's reading of the law, Campbell has concluded that this must be Paul, doing speech in character, essentially, of what his opponents would say, and then responding to that in later chapters. I don't find that all that compelling, because there's not a lot of markers. I mean, there's no markers that he is introducing other speakers here. So I started from the perspective, from the assumption that Paul's probably saying what he thinks, and then how then does that actually play together with the restoration eschatology that we see in other Pauline passages and also in other Second Temple Jewish texts?
So then what is, how do you, if you start from Romans 2, right, and you look at a verse like verse 13, right, where it is, the doers of the law who will be justified, what do you do with, that text versus, Romans 3, 20 and 21, right, where, no flesh will be justified before him through, erga nomu, right? How do you? I know obviously you don't deal with that problem, right? But if we read 2:13 at face value, it's do Torah, but you will be justified, right? Whatever justified means, But so what is that text saying? And then how do we read, Romans 3 in light of that? Because typically it's just been done the other way around, right? Typically it's just said, oh, okay, well, we have Romans 3. Let's read 2 in light of that, right? And when reading 2 in light of that, we just say, oh, this person doesn't exist, or it's hypothetical, or, whatever else, right? But we just haven't said, to go the other way forces you also into an interpretation of really the other passage as well, right? So how would you deal with that tension?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's really well put, that typically what's happened is people have read Romans 3 and then they've read Romans 2, they've read backwards into Romans 2 to say, okay, this is what this must mean. And I think the letter should be read forwards. Romans 2 comes before Romans 3 for a reason, right? Paul is setting up Romans 3 with what he says in Romans 2. So we should read it forward in Romans 2 is helping us understand what he says in Romans 3, or at least it should be. And my understanding of this is that Paul is dealing with what I think in the book I called it the paradox of justness, or of justification, and that is that in order to do just things, just people do just things, but you don't become just by doing just things, right? You have to actually be a just person who's going to do those just things. So the problem then is, how does one become justified? How does one actually become justified in the sense of becoming a doer of good? And Paul's argument is, you can't actually go about it by doing the works of Torah, by, circumcision or observing specific requirements that are in the Torah, that doesn't actually solve the problem. So if I actually want to, if I want to use another book of the New Testament to kind of explain this, in Matthew, Jesus says, unless your justness or your, dikaiosune exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Which, that's a big deal, because these are people who are actively going about making sure that they do the erga nomu, the works of Torah. But Jesus says that's insufficient. And if you read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, the issue there is, and he said, this says it well in the, if your eye offends you, if your hand offends you, then cut it off, if it causes you to sin. Well, of course, the key to that passage is recognizing that nobody's eye or hand actually causes them to sin. Jesus says elsewhere that sin comes from the heart. So what is it that you need in order for your justice or your justness to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees? You need a new heart that will then ensure that you don't covet, that you don't hate your brother in your heart, because it's not the murder that's exactly what this is getting after. What it's getting after is, if you hate your brother in your heart, then you also are worthy of judgment, right? So the issue here is that doing those erga nomu doesn't actually deal with the heart problem that is the root of sin and that causes people to disobey God and ultimately causes people to fall short of keeping the Torah fully. So what I see is Romans 2 saying, yes, the doer of the Torah will be justified, will be vindicated in this case. And of course, that terminology has the nice double meaning there. It can be either one. And what I see him saying is, according to what I'm saying, the people who are the doers of Torah will be justified. And then what does he say? For when Gentiles who do not have the Torah, or when Gentiles who do not have the Torah, instinctively or by nature perform the Torah or do Torah, these, though not having the Torah, become a Torah to themselves, in that they what? Manifest, they demonstrate the work of Torah written in their hearts, their conscience testifying and alternately accusing or defending them. And the work of Torah written in on their hearts is really important language here, because that, of course, connects you with the one place in early Jewish literature where we have discussion of the Torah written on the heart, which is the new covenant promise to Israel and Judah. In those days says, Adonai, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers, the covenant which they broke when I led them, when I led them by the hand out of Egypt, the covenant which they broke. But this will be the covenant that I will make with them. I will write my Torah on their hearts. And the conclusion of that is, and they will all know me from the least of them to the greatest, and no longer will they need to be taught. And of course, Paul then says, you are theodidaktoi, you are taught of God, in 1 Thessalonians. Here he's saying you have the Torah written on your heart. The whole point here is that the Torah written on the heart then makes the person obedient, so that they do the things that the Torah requires. And this is what we see later on in Romans 2, where Paul talks about the person who has had the circumcision of the heart, which is similar terminology that is drawing actually from the Hebrew version of Deuteronomy 30. Interestingly, the Greek, the extant Greek versions don't have circumcision of the heart there, but he's drawing from Deuteronomy 30, which is interpreted together with Jeremiah 31 and other early Jewish literature. Those together with Ezekiel 36 often get kind of put together in this stew. You see this, say, at the beginning of Jubilees, where it's doing this. He interprets those together, and the person with the circumcision of the heart is the person who does the dikaioma to nomu, the just things of the Torah. And that is what makes that person then liable to be judged justly. So the idea here is that you have unjust people, which he's already set up in Romans 1. These are people who are unjust and thereby under the judgment of God for injustice. They can't become just by doing these things of Torah, because the heart is really the problem, and they're going to fail in doing so. So what needs to happen is God needs to make the unjust people just so that he can then justly judge those newly justified people as just people and give them eternal life. So that, I think, is what's going on in Romans 2. And by the time you get to Romans 3, he's explaining that, look, doing these things of the Torah, deciding to keep these specific commands of the written Torah, cannot and never has actually changed the heart such that people actually keep the full covenant the way that God intended. Instead, what needs to happen is the promise that Deuteronomy makes when Moses tells the people, when he's giving the speech in Deuteronomy, to this day, the Lord Adonai has not given you hearts to know or eyes to see. Well, Paul is saying what needs to happen is to get the heart to know and the eyes to see that Moses says you're going to get eventually. That's Deuteronomy 30, which comes after that. He says God will give you hearts to know. God will circumcise your hearts, and then all these things are going to be doable. So I think that's the basic idea that is in play in Romans 2.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'm actually doing work on Torah in the Messianic era, and I'm working on a lot of Romans 2 as well, and also Romans 8. And I think Romans 8 as well, where it's very, very clear, and I see you cite this passage all over and over and over again, right? It's very clear, like, you actually are fulfilling the Torah, right? Like the people who have the Spirit are just doing it, right? So there's no reason, then to go back to Romans 2 and say, this is impossible, right? You just don't have to do that. I mean, even if you just read Romans 8, like, you would come to that conclusion that whoever has the Spirit is, part of the new covenant. And that means the law is written on their heart. That means they're doing Torah in a different way, right? And then it allows you to read Romans 3, like, ergo nomu is just referring to basically trying to be righteous through the old covenant, right? Which we know doesn't work, right? Because it hasn't worked, right? It still wasn't working. There's just
not only did it not work, but Moses in Deuteronomy repeatedly tells the people that it won't work. Like, that's the thing that is regularly missed. And I was blown away when I was doing the research for this book, and I kept finding people saying, what Paul says about the Torah here, that, when he says, what was life for me became death. Like, for Paul to say something like this about the Torah is just, it's beyond the pale for an early Jew. I'm like, he's citing Deuteronomy 30, where I set before you life and death, the blessing and a curse. And Moses says to the people then, by the way, you're not going to observe this, so it's going to be death for you. Like, Moses repeatedly in Deuteronomy tells the people, like, God has not given you hearts to know, so you're going to inevitably do this. The Song of Moses is all about Deuteronomy 32, which I think Paul is a very close reader of, is all about this. It's saying, well, the people are going to, you all are going to rebel. Yeshurun grew fat and kicked and all of this stuff. And, then I will make you jealous by a non-people, by a foolish nation, et cetera, et cetera. And, then eventually I will restore you, and I will, I will make you into a transformed and obedient people, once you've learned your lesson and I've been vindicated as just. Which, that's what a lot of Deuteronomy is about. It's God basically saying, you all, not great. You're not great. I, however, have been more than just in my treatment of you, and I will continue to be just beyond measure, and I will show you mercy to demonstrate how great I am. Like, that's Deuteronomy. And, when Paul then brings in that you may be vindicated in your judgment, this is totally in keeping with what we see in Deuteronomy, where, again, like I said, he's not inventing anything here. Deuteronomy explicitly says, it has Moses say, this is not going to work so well for you. It's just not. So it's not going to work until God transforms your hearts. When he circumcises your hearts, then that's all going to work out. So good luck until then. And then Moses dies. And then we're told, since that day, no prophet has arisen. And of course, that's anistemi, which is the word that's used for resurrection in the New Testament. No prophet like Moses has arisen in Israel. And Paul thinks that the prophet like Moses has arisen, like resurrected, and now is giving Israel the capacity that Moses wasn't able to give them and that the Torah talked about but couldn't actually deliver and promised for the future. Paul says it's here now through Jesus.
Right. And so I think the natural conclusion, right, and this is how I'm reading you, and you kind of say this explicitly in your book, is to conclude that the people talked about in Romans 2 are part of Israel, right? They in this. So I can just read this quote. You say, in the same way that Israel became indistinguishable from Gentiles through disobedience and behaving like the other nations, Gentiles are now being incorporated into the new covenant community through the law written on their hearts and behaving like faithful, obedient Israelites. So one question I have is, why doesn't Paul call them Israelites here? So it's particularly like at the end of the chapter, and I know we've talked a little about Romans 2:28 and 29, what that is saying, and what the syntax is saying there. But why doesn't he just say those Gentiles who have the law written on their hearts are Israelites? Because he goes back and forth. It says, like, he's talking about Jews, right, that are in secret, and those that are outward. And there's no mention of Israel. So why? I mean,
not until Romans 9.
Right.
Yeah. I think part of that is that Romans is an iterative argument. So I don't think Paul is ready to go there just yet. I think he steps back from that argument because he wants to leave it until the end of Romans 11, when he finally lets that cat out of the bag with this all Israel statement in Romans 11:26, after which he then proceeds into the, this, doxology, basically, glorifying God for the wonders that he has hidden from past ages, this sort of thing. But I think what he tries to do here is he's laying the foundation. So I think Romans 2 interestingly matches up closely with both Romans 8 and Romans 11. I think he's got certain cycles of the argument that he's setting up here, that if the careful reader who's read all of Romans, who knows the prophets and all of this, can identify a lot of what he's doing, but it's only really clear once he's actually gotten to the end of the argument. So you can see it, and you can start to realize that, like, proleptically, I think he's putting it in place. But I think he's holding off, partly because I suspect that his audience, if he just came out and said, therefore these Gentiles are Israelites, all right, let's move on, I think he's aware that his audience is going to be like, whoa, wait, back that truck up. Like I think you've just skipped over some steps. I think what he does then from Romans 3 through Romans 11 is to explain, like, here's how these former Gentiles who've received the Spirit are, in fact, resurrected Israelites, as it were. They're people who've been made into Israelites from the nations, and this is part of the plan of God. I think he holds that off. He holds the top card in the deck until the final play, and then he puts it on the table and goes, okay, here's what I've been holding all along. And I think it's just a rhetorical move.
Well, it is interesting because in Romans 8, he does come back to this idea of being obedient to Torah, right? And that is the sort of, and the Spirit, especially, right? And that's, at this point in the
sons
argument,
of God.
Right. And I mean, in Romans 2, there's the Torah written on the heart, but you don't see the Spirit empowering, like you see it in Romans 8, where Romans 8, like that, you just screams at you, okay, and it's the Spirit at work in these people, and that, I think, would you just have to conclude, right? If the Gentiles, that is the argument as well in Acts for baptizing Cornelius. It's like, well, if the Spirit has descended, then we can't withhold baptism from him, right? That's just then
who are we to argue with God?
Right, exactly. And so if you have demonstrated that these people really are keeping Torah in the way that the new covenant would propose, and they really have been given the Spirit, then it is, what are they if they're not part of Israel, right? In that, it would just have to be, you'd have to be part of the new covenant, right? So
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is he does mention Spirit one time in Romans 2. It's in 229 that
right.
it is the circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by letter, right?
Yeah.
So at that point, that's the hook that he then picks back up in Romans 8. What he's done is he's connected the circumcision of the heart, the law, the Torah written on the heart, with the Spirit, which he does elsewhere. He does that in 2 Corinthians 3, where you've got new covenant. He says new covenant, which is Jeremiah 31. Then he immediately in the same spot ties that to reception of the Spirit, which is Ezekiel 36. And then he's doing this in light of the end of Deuteronomy, which is the main passage that he's going through there. So he's putting these three things together there as well. But Romans 2 sets the template. It puts the foundation down of this is what's going on. It's the law, the Torah in the heart promised to Israel, the circumcision of the heart promised to Israel, and the Spirit promised to Israel. Okay, now let's go on to Romans 3, and he leaves that off. And by the time you get to Romans 8, he's now explaining how this actually works. And when you read Romans 2 in light of Romans 8, all of that makes sense. And of course, Romans 2 has set the stage for how to read Romans 8. And then, of course, that leads to the problem that he brings up in Romans 9, which is, okay, wait, hold on. So what you're saying then, if these people are receiving the Spirit and they're children of God, which is that's also Israel. So they're children of God, they're receiving the Spirit, and all of this is going down, but these are not, these are uncircumcised men. Has God abandoned his people? Well, then he goes into, well, let me explain how this actually works in terms of this is not a departure from God's fidelity to Israel. In fact, this is God's fidelity to Israel beyond the grave, as it were. That God has remained so faithful to Israel that he's actually going to bring Israel back from a state of being gone, of non-being, of death. And that this is actually the ultimate victory of God, not only over the nations, but over the gods of the nations and over, the powers of this age, that he is resurrecting his people from among the nations. From these uncircumcised people are actually resurrected Israelites, and this is God's victory. So I think that's what he does. And again, it all works nicely. By the time you get to the end of Romans 8, you should be asking, but these are uncircumcised men. This is not what how does this work? This is supposed to be Israel. This is not what we're supposed to be seeing. And then he spends 3 chapters explaining that and saying, no, this is actually God's faithfulness to Israel that is being revealed through these uncircumcised men receiving the Spirit.
Yeah. So I want to get into this now, this Romans 9 through 11 stuff. Because, we could talk about any of these passages for a very long time, but so I think that's a really good summary of kind of just the argument, right? So, but you make some very specific, again, like I said, I mean, you're a very careful reader of the text, and necessarily so, right? Because we're just dealing with texts that have been combed over so often. What is your reading? I know you wrote an article recently on this as well. What is your reading of the 2 vessels at the end of Romans and 9? How does that fit in to this whole reading? Because, again, so many people read Romans 9, in light of Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? Or it's just certain, especially, on a lay level, it's just like predestination, it's like, what is he saying? But your picture of Romans 9 through 11 is very different than most people's. So how does that inform how we read this particular text?
Yeah, once again, I think the most important thing to bring in, and you mentioned this is all in the Harvard Theological Review article, which is open access if anybody wants to download that. That's available.
Yeah, we'll definitely put a link in the show notes as well.
But the basic thing here, the basic thing for me is, if we're going to read this passage well, which is about God, it's comparing God to a potter who works with clay, making different vessels from a single lump. If we're going to read this carefully, we need to know how this image is used in the early Jewish literature in the scripture and early Jewish literature that Paul's pulling from. And the largest and most best known example of this is in Jeremiah 18, where God compares himself to a potter. He tells Jeremiah, "Go out and I want you to watch a potter at work." And then the potter's working with the clay, and the clay becomes misshapen in the potter's hand, and then the potter balls it back up and makes it into something else. And then God says, "See, am I not like this potter? Am I not also able to improvise? Can I not then, if I declare a word about a nation or a person or a people, and that person or nation or people does something different, they change their behavior, can I not then change my intention for that people?" Well, that's a pretty big statement. Like, God actually says, like, the way that people respond to him is going to then impact whether he follows through with the plan that he has stated for that people. Otherwise, he'll change the plan and state something else and then do something else. So this is establishing an interactive notion of how God works with his people. And actually, in Jeremiah, in the narrative of Jeremiah, there's two aspects of this, because this is then followed up by an appeal to the people for repentance, saying, there's, why will you die? Like, repent, change your ways, house of Judah, please do so. And then they don't. And then the next chapter is God telling Jeremiah to take a finished pot and go out and break it in the sight of the people and say, "Okay, well, here's what's going to happen." So now, the time in which they were pliable and were given the opportunity to change and to submit to God's hand is gone, and so now they'll be destroyed, because they hardened themselves. So that's the kind of narrative that's underlying, I think, what Paul's pulling on here when he compares God to potter. This is something. That's 2 full chapters of a prophet. So, in terms of that image, so my reading of what's going on in Romans 9:19 through 24 is that that Paul is presenting God as a God of pathos. I'm borrowing language from Abraham Joshua Heschel there, where God is responsive and interactive, working with stubborn clay. And if you read anything from any era of people who work with clay, potters who work with clay, they always refer to clay as very stubborn, having a mind of its own, and all of these things, which makes it a great image for stubborn people. It's a very poor choice of image if you want to use this as an example of God being able to do whatever he wants, with something that's inert. The thing about clay is that it feels like it's fighting against you when it's spinning on the wheel. God is working with Israel in particular and humanity in general in this relational process. And so when God makes these decisions, this is not a unilateral decision in which he forces people to make specific decisions for his own purposes. Rather, he is in a constant relational, in a constant interactive relationship with the clay that he's working with, and how the clay responds to God's hand is going to have impact on what ultimately happens with that clay. And so his argument is, in the article I get into some into some fairly detailed weeds about the Greek definitions, about the vocabulary that he uses here, which is very specialized vocabulary. I argue that he does not say that God is endured with much patience, vessels of wrath, destined for destruction or predestined for destruction. It actually says that God has produced vessels of wrath, which of course is a language that is borrowed from Jeremiah 50:25. So he's pulling from that and saying God has produced these vessels of wrath and reshaped for destruction. And the word that he uses there is not predestined, but rather a word that notes bringing something to, it's the same word that's used for, mending nets and fixing something that's broken. The idea here is that he's in an iterative process of of responsively reshaping based on how the clay is responding to his hand. And he has the right to make from one lump, and I think the one lump is the same lump that we see later on in Romans 11, which Paul identifies as Israel, make different, people for different purposes and to different destinies from that same lump. So I think that's what's going on in that passage. And he's explaining that, God has had a right to deal with his people the way that he has, that when Israel didn't submit to his hand, he had a right to, take them in a particular direction, just like what Jeremiah said he would. And that this is a defense of God's justice in the face of what has happened to Israel over the generations.
So this leads into, the Hosea quotes about, not my people, right? How does that fit into the argument? Because you discuss this quite a bit in the book, and I found it very helpful. How does that relate to what has just been said and to Gentile inclusion?
Yeah, I think Hosea is actually one of the most foundational pieces of scripture for Paul. There's actually a book by Robert Foster, that argues this, that Paul is reading Hosea together with the narratives of the patriarchs in Genesis and a few other things as really foundational to his arguments here. And I think he's basically right about that. But I think the key thing here is to remember that Hosea is a prophet to the northern kingdom. These are non-Jewish Israelites that Hosea is speaking to. And Hosea says, God is basically divorcing you. And that's the language that Jeremiah uses when he references Hosea. God gave Israel their certificate of divorce, and he sent them away for their breaking the covenant because Israel was unfaithful. They were an unfaithful spouse to God, to the God of Israel. And so God declares to them, you are not my people, lo ami. And Paul reads this not my people, I think, in a really interesting way, because, I think he reads this together, by the way, with the non-people or the not people, from Deuteronomy 32:21 in the Song of Moses, which refers to that as well. And I think he reads this, in a specific way where he understands that Israel is my people, right? That you will be my people and I will be your God. That's what makes Israel Israel. That's what makes them the people of God in the Torah. But then my people become not my people, which I think he reads not my people as meaning non-Israelites. And we got to remember, before the first century, goy or ethne is not, in the Hebrew Bible, ethne or goy these are not the standard terms meaning just non-Israelite. If you're going to look for a term that means something closest to non-Israelite, it's going to be not my people. And I think Paul reads that meaning non-Israelites, and he reads that terminology in light of Israel's breaking of the covenant, the divorce of Israel, then the scattering and assimilation of Israel among the nations, and concludes, along with, say, a reading of 2 Kings 17, that Israel was essentially Gentilized, that they ceased to be Israel by virtue, and this is especially the northern kingdom that Hosea is talking about. Hosea is not prophesying this about Judah, right? So if we want to talk about this in terms of like the prodigal son story, there are two sons. One of them stays home. The other one's out with the pigs. And the other one that's out with the pigs is the north, right? The one that's left behind and is still with the father is Judah. Well, Israel in 2 Kings 17 it says they followed the nothing and they became nothing. They followed the nations that surrounded them. And then it breaks off, actually. It doesn't actually finish the parallel phrase. I think Paul finishes that parallel phrase in his own head and says, and became the nations that surrounded them. So they followed the nothing and became nothing. They followed the nations that surrounded them, and by implication, they became the nations that surrounded them. So Israel becomes gentilized and become assimilated among the nations. But Paul also thinks that God is going to be faithful to his promise that he will regather and restore Israel from not my people, which is what Hosea then follows up with. I will one day say to those who are not my people, and I will redeem you from the nations among whom I scattered you. So when Paul sees then Gentiles receiving the Spirit, non-Jews, uncircumcised men receiving the Spirit promised to Israel as a part of the new covenant restoration, I think for him, the pretty natural move is to conclude that these Spirit-filled Gentiles are essentially resurrected Israelites who've been redeemed from the nations. And I think that's what he argues in Romans 9-11.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you do assume your sort of model like of the problem, right, of like, okay, we're expecting the restoration of Israel, then really there's only two options. I mean, you like, it's not just Jews, right? Like you have to have more than just Judah, right, to restore Israel. So you have to have people that are outside of Judah, right? And it could be Samaria, right? Or other nations, right? I mean, I don't really know another option, right? For Paul to say
there is an alternative. There is one alternative that shows up actually in like Fourth Ezra, for example, which is just a little bit after Paul, written just a little bit after Paul, and this is the idea that you have the northern tribes. They all, like the faithful people from the northern tribes who were scattered, they all went east. And in Fourth Ezra, they went so far east that they're, sort of out of sight, out of memory, but they've been multiplying in great numbers way out there, and they're across the Sabbath River. This legend kind of grows, but basically they're, at some point in the future, God is going to restore these people that are way out there. They're so far out there, none of us are in contact with them anymore. But then these Israelites will come back. And we see a hint of that even in Josephus as well, who's also a first century Jew, who says, in his explanation of what happened to Israel when he so Josephus in the Antiquities uses Israel language all the way up until Book 11. And then he doesn't use it again in Antiquities, and he doesn't use it anywhere else in his corpus, in the Josephine corpus. After Book 11, he uses Yehudaioi all the time. And he explains when he makes the transition from here forward, basically, I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to call them Judea. I'm going to call them Jews because they're, Judah was the preeminent tribe to come from those places, from that place. And from Judah, the land took its name, and also the rest of the people, even though there's a couple other tribes there. As for the 10 tribes, though, he says, they remain across the Euphrates to the east in great numbers. Right. And he indicates this and there's actually a little bit of a undercurrent there that, Rome may, and he says, therefore, only the 2 tribes have come under Roman rule, but the 10 tribes, they're across the Euphrates in great numbers. And there's this implication of like, when God wants, the 10 tribes will sweep in and Rome will be no more kind of thing. So there is this option. That's a third option. So you have the Samaritans, but the problem with the Samaritans is that they're only the Joseph tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Then you've got, you've still got to get the rest. So you've got the Samaritans, and then you've got the others that are out there somewhere that you see this show up in some of these other places. Also, the book of Tobit has, Tobias family goes to, they go further and further east as God continues to preserve this Naphthalite family. They're Naphthalite Israelites, right? They're not Jews. And so this is a live option, but the other option is, well, they assimilated. They're, and God is going to have to bring them back, going to have to call them out from the nations in the same way that he did Abraham in the first place when Abraham was uncircumcised. And that is the option that Paul takes, is they've been put into the state that Abraham was before he was called, and now they're going to have to be called out like Abraham was. And just like Abraham was uncircumcised when he received the promise, so they too are also uncircumcised when they receive the fulfillment of the promise. So I think that's what he does that is distinctive. And, for what it's worth, it's interesting that, the synoptic gospels have, the gospels to be preached Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And the ends of the earth is Deuteronomic language for where Israel will be scattered for breaking the covenant.
Right.
It says, though I scatter you to the ends of the earth. Same thing in there's one spot in Leviticus that it says the same thing. So this is it's all getting back to this notion of God redeeming Israel, and God is redeeming Israel, according to Paul, by basically resurrecting Israel from the Gentilized state that he called Abraham from in the first place.
Right. So I want to ask two quick questions if you have a little bit more time. I mean, they might not be that quick. So let me know if you do run out of time here. But one of the things is, okay, so we have this Gentile inclusion thing. How does the Messiah then fit into this picture? I mean, I don't know, that's again kind of a big question. So in particular, I had this. We started this series with a conversation with Josh Chip, and we were talking about Messiah, right? And his work on that. And I asked him the question, like, how does the Messiah change the identity of Israel? And he just said, oh, well, it doesn't. And I said, well, if the Messiah, if with the coming of the Messiah, you have Gentile inclusion, Gentiles being grafted in, right? Then how wouldn't that change, Israel's composition, right? And he basically concluded we should ask you about it. So I feel like, just kind of in, required to ask you, does the Messiah change the identity of Israel? How does this work? I mean, for me, when I see particularly Romans 10, right, where the Messiah comes back in, right, the Christ, he comes back in, and it leads into Romans 11 where you have the grafting in. It seems like the Messiah is the thing that allows for the integration of Gentiles into Israel. And I think that's how I'm reading you, but you can correct me if I'm mistaken there.
So this is tricky for a couple reasons. One is I on the one hand I agree with Josh that I don't think Paul understands Jesus as changing Israel in the sense of like Israel becomes something else. I don't think that's right. I think for Paul, I think from Paul's perspective, the Messiah restores Israel and raises Israel from the dead, giving Israel the life that the Torah promised but couldn't itself deliver. So, I mean, again, you got to remember that properly speaking, there was no Israel in Paul's day, right? Paul is, the land that Paul is, the land that has its metropolis as Jerusalem is Judea. It's Judah. When Ezra and Nehemiah return and they, you have the return from Babylon, they don't establish a renewed Israel. They establish Judah. And, you see the same sorts of things throughout the Second Temple period. So properly speaking, there isn't Israel in Paul's day. I mean, where's the tribe of Reuben?
So Israel just doesn't exist in your view.
Yeah, Israel has, for Paul, Israel has died.
Right.
Right, like the Messiah. And Paul thinks that the Messiah, through his death and resurrection, has come to revivify and reunify Israel and Judah, giving them all eternal life through the Spirit and making them obedient, transforming them into an obedient and just people, no longer subject to and assimilated among the nations, but now in position to be glorified to rule not only over the world, but over the angels themselves. I mean, this is what he sees. So Israel becomes glorified in the process, but I don't think Israel is, like in terms of the nature of its composition, that Paul sees this as fundamentally different, other than that Israel is now empowered to do what the Torah, pointed to all along. And one of the reasons that I say that is Israel was always if you read the Hebrew Bible carefully, Israel was always incorporating non-Israelites from outside and grafting them in. I mean, the first story we get in the book in the conquest narrative of Joshua involves the integration of Rahab and her whole family, and they become Israelites. They're Canaanites who through her fidelity to the God of Israel and her pledge to serve the God of Israel, they become engrafted into Israel. And the people that cross over into over the Jordan to begin with, when they come out of Egypt, They are a mixed multitude. This is not just the descendants of Israel. This is a mixed multitude that then intermarry into the descendants of Israel, and they become engrafted into Israel. And, David, Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah, the Hittite. He's a Hittite. He's not an Israelite. He's one of the mighty men, right? Over and over and over again, we find that, and by the way, Rahab, in Jewish tradition, Rahab marries Joshua. So, I mean, this is part and parcel of the whole process all along, that there always was an avenue for, engrafting of non-Israelites into Israel, where they become Israelites, or at least their children become Israelites. So that's always a possibility. And I think what Paul does is he says this is happening by becoming Israelites in the way that Abraham became Abraham. Like the Spirit then selects you out and draws you into this, and now you become a part of this people through this engrafting process. And the process is a little bit different, but I think he sees the basic idea is the same.
So you think people in, like, all those people, those, Gentiles, Uriah, and all those people would have been considered Israel even if they weren't circumcised? Because that to me is the difference. Post Messiah, right? It's you don't have to be circumcised anymore, right? And in that sense, it is different than, prior Messiah.
Yeah. That actually is the means of entrance, the means of engrafting, I think, does change. But I think that there's also some evidence that, throughout the Hebrew Bible, you have some different notions of exactly how that works anyway. But I do think you're right that prior to Messiah, Paul would have said, circumcision, is a necessary thing, physical circumcision. But Paul doesn't think that these Gentiles are uncircumcised.
Right.
I mean, he makes that clear, right? He thinks that they are circumcised people. It's just that their heart has been circumcised, which is what the Torah was all about to begin with. And in my reading of what he does with the Abraham narrative, I think he understands Abraham as having received physical circumcision as a consequence of his disobedient behavior, of his unjust behavior with Hagar. And so the law followed the trespass, essentially. And, Genesis 15 is the part that matters most for those who are coming in the state that Abraham was to begin with. Just don't behave like he did with Hagar, and you don't need circumcision. And since you've had the circumcision of the heart already, well, this has actually already got you to where you need to go. Now, the interesting question, and I've kicked this around a good bit. I can't really go there in the book because it's speculative. I do wonder what Paul would have said or did say to parents who had baby boys within the church in his communities. Okay, so we just had a baby boy. Should we circumcise him on the 8th day or not? Paul is pretty adamant that you do not become a part of Israel by receiving physical circumcision, but rather by receiving the Spirit. But once you're actually integrated and you're part of Israel and then you have a child, I wonder, and I suspect that at least for Jewish parents, he would have said, yeah, keep doing it.
Right. So, I mean, I think that would exactly be the distinction, right? If you're Jewish, right, then, fine. But if you're a Gentile, you are Israel, but not circumcised.
But not physically circumcised.
Right. And I think that is the category, right? That's exactly the sort of category that is, I feel like, missing in Old Covenant, right? The true Israelite in every sense except circumcision.
Yeah, well, and again, I think the key there though is that the thing that's different is throughout the Hebrew Bible, you don't have Israel as a whole having the circumcision of the heart.
Right. You would have to have
that's
both.
What Moses explicitly. That's what Moses explicitly tells them.
Right.
It's like, yeah, God hasn't done this with you yet.
Right.
And for Paul, that's been done. So if there's anything about Israel that's been changed, it's that they've been given circumcised hearts and they've been resurrected from the dead in the sense of being made into a people from a not people.
Right.
And now they're awaiting the final stage of the resurrection, which is, this, glorification. So Israel is changed in those respects, but I think it's, I don't think Paul would say Israel is that there's been a, ontological change in, sort of what Israel is or whatnot. I think he would have pointed to, like, look, I mean, in Jesus' own genealogy, you have multiple descendant people who are not descendants of Israel who are a part of this, and they're grafted in, and this is always the way it's been.
So in that sense, then Israel is just not an exclusively, ethnic term, and I think that's part of exclusively.
What does ethnic mean?
Oh, right. No, I know.
What does ethnic mean? Right. So that's the thing. I think for Paul, it is completely an ethnic term. It is. But we have to get away from this idea that ethnicity is solely based on parentage, that it's solely based on genealogy. I think the ethnicity, race, all of it, because look, race is every bit, race is a cultural thing. Race is a cultural construct as much as it is about, even today, race is a cultural construct, right? These are categories that are cultural every bit as much as there is a, genealogical function. And I think New Testament interpreters have gotten themselves in real trouble by assuming that ethnicity or race is solely based on genealogy, on genetics, essentially. And that's never been true in any place, in any time. Adoption immediately changes that game at every level, in every culture that's ever existed. So, anytime we're talking about ethnicity, we're dealing with a whole bundle of, Paula Fredrickson has a really good bit on this in her latest JBL piece, where she talks about the bundle of, God, God, culture, norms, that are practiced within the group. Then genealogy is a part of it, but not, all of it. All of this is bundled together. So for me, when Paul says Israel, and when he talks about Israelites, he is absolutely talking about something that in his mind maps onto what for us would be ethnic or racial, an ethnic or racial category. They don't have the degree of, separating some of those things out that happens in modern scholarship in terms of trying to define, like, well, is this an ethnic category or a religious category? For him, that would be an incoherent distinction. But even if we're going to read the term ethnic or ethnicity back into this, I think he absolutely thinks of Israel and Israeliteness as an ethnic concept. He just thinks that God can transform some people from one ethnicity into another. And of course, there are examples of this in any intermarriage situation where, the whole point of what I think of his reading of what's going on with Israel is Israel becomes gentilized. They become other ethnicities as they intermarry into those ethnicities. And now God is remaking, is revivifying, is resurrecting Israel from those different ethnicities and establishing them as the ethnic identity of Israel once again. And I think that's what he's doing. So these are not like Israelites who just aren't aware that they're Israelites or something like that, where you just need to go back and look at the genealogy closely enough, which for what it's worth, I think actually, in First Timothy, where it talks about, excessive attention to genealogy, I wonder whether or not that's actually what this is talking about, of like, basically Gentile converts coming in and trying to figure out like how far back maybe they might have had an Israelite parent, and that this is, how this works. And whoever, whether it's Paul or, some other Pauline author of First Timothy, they're going, that's a waste of time. It's about the Spirit. The Spirit is what transforms you into this ethnic state.
You're
into
already
this ethnic
an Israelite.
Status. That's right.
So this is the last question. and I knew I got in trouble when I mentioned ethnicity and then race, because you have a very extensive discussion on those terms, which I actually agreed with, but I'm stuck with these terms and how it's been used. But and then I thought genealogical, and then I thought, oh well, they're also sons of Abraham. So I don't really know what the term is, But that is the actual point, is that they're completely
That's the point.
They're completely there, like in every sense, right? I mean, I think that is the big idea.
And not only are they sons of Abraham, but there are some folks who with whom I'm arguing against in this book, who say, well, they're children of Abraham, but they're definitely not Israelites, because Jews are Israelites, and they're obviously not Jews. He includes them as descendants of Israel in the wilderness in First Corinthians 10, right? He says, our fathers. When our fathers were in the wilderness, well, if those are our fathers, those are Israelites. Those are people from Israel. So not only Abraham, but Israel, they're integrated into the genealogy. And I think in general, in the ancient world, people were more comfortable with what we might call fictive kinship. That, you're integrated into the genealogy by that dotted line that, well, you're adopted. And guess what language Paul uses for these people coming in? That they have been adopted. You talk about Romans 8. These people are being adopted as sons.
Yep, genealogical. So all the terms apply. So Romans 11, just really quick, 25 and 26. So many people have struggled over this passage. A partial insensibility has come upon Israel for a while, and thus all Israel will be saved. What does that mean?
Well, you left out the part that I think is the most important there, which is until the fullness of the nations comes in,
right?
And thus all Israel will be saved. So the fullness of the nations is actually the means by which all Israel will be saved. And basically what I see here is a historical restatement of restoration eschatology, that Israel disobeyed and became insensible, and a portion of Israel became insensible. And basically we see in the olive tree that, once you become insensible, you're cut off, right? If you persist in infidelity, then the branches are cut off. And there are multiple iterations of this kind of pruning process in Israel's history, where parts of Israel are cut off, and then you have the remnant that remains. You have the part that remains, which is the remnant. And I think what he says is parts of Israel became. Parts of Israel became insensible, or Israel became partly insensible. And I think for him, this is a historical fact. It's just indisputable. You read scripture and you find out that, like, Israel over and over and over again experienced these partial hardenings over and over again. And, ultimately that led to being scattered among the nations. But that then allowed for the ingathering of the fullness of the nations, which I argue in this book, and also I argued back in the JBL article in 2011, which also is now open access after 10 years.
Which we can also put in the show notes.
Yeah, my argument there is that when he says fullness of the nations, this is a very strange bit of wording, and lots of people have struggled with it on what he means by fullness of the nations. And it turns out there's one other example of that exact phrase that shows up elsewhere in early Jewish literature, and that's in Genesis 48:19, where when Joseph blesses the two children or when Jacob blesses the two children of Joseph, who, by the way, are part African. Remember, Joseph marries the Egyptian priestess, the daughter of the priest of On. So, once again, we have ingrafting from the outside illustrated in Joseph's children. But when he blesses Joseph's children, he puts the right hand on Ephraim, and he says, his seed will become the fullness of the nations. And this is such a difficult phrase in the Hebrew, Maloha Goyim. This is such an odd phrase in Hebrew that, first of all, it doesn't appear anywhere else. And second of all, in the Septuagint, it is actually harmonized to the promise to Abraham and also to Jacob, where your seed will become a multitude of nation, or will become a multitude of peoples. So they change it in the versions of the Septuagint that have been passed down to us. But the Hebrew itself just says the fullness of the nations, which is a very strange thing, that his seed will become that. I think, again, Paul is reading this through the lenses of Hosea, and Israel, specifically Hosea, not only is talking to the northern kingdom of Israel, but there are places where Hosea explicitly addresses Ephraim, which is the chief tribe of the northern kingdom. And Ephraim is to be scattered. So this is the son that is to become the fullness of the nations. And it's that son that then gets scattered among the nations. And even with the Samaritans, the usual Jewish polemic is, you guys are a bunch of intermarried, non-pure Israelite house. Like, you're not real Israelites, you intermarried. Well, that's the slur about the Samaritans who associate themselves with Ephraim and Manasseh. And then this goes further with all of the others that were scattered among the nations. And I think Paul reads this and says, if the promise to Ephraim is actually to be fulfilled, Ephraim had to become insensible in order to be sown among the nations, so that Ephraim's seed would be all among the nations. And now the harvest of Ephraim's seed is being reaped from the nations. And this is how all Israel, and I think that's the emphasis here, and this is how all Israel, not just the Jews, not just Jews and Samaritans, but all of Israel will be saved. And so then he brings, I see this as like the moment he puts his whole, hand on the table and says, here's my royal flush. The whole plan all along has been for God to integrate all of the nations within the promise to Abraham. And the means of doing this was for disobedient. Well, first of all, since Israel disobeyed, the means of doing this became, and this is where I think the potter clay thing actually works in here. It may have been done differently had Israel obeyed, but since Israel disobeyed, the means for doing it is to use Israel's disobedience to extend the promise to Israel, to the nations in which Israel is now scattered and irredeemably scattered, it would seem. But since the promise is still to Israel, now those among whom Israel has been integrated, the promise applies to them too. And this is how all Israel will be saved. I think that's the conclusion to the argument.
Meaning that Israel includes people that we often don't think of as Israel, if I can say it
That's
that
right.
way. Non-Jews.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it includes, and again, pretty much anybody within the Second Temple period would understand that Israel has to include non-Jews. But uncircumcised non-Jews from the Greeks, they're not Israelites.
Right.
And Paul's saying, if they've received the Spirit, that is God's stamp of approval that they are, in fact, Israelites, and you'd better get used to it. That's his argument.
So I'll give you the last word on this, on how do you defend your view against someone who just says it's the same thing as supersessionism? Because it is, in like, part of that whole argument has been that Judaism equals Israel, right? And so they've read Israel as, look, this is like, Israel is, they, again, I'm talking for them here, but ethnic Jews, right? And Paul,
but what does ethnic mean, of course?
Right, I know. But Paul Friedrichsen says this, right? I mean, in a recent article, she just says flat out that, I take this to mean Israel equals ethnic Jewish, right? And so at that point,
I have to say, I found that kind of interesting from her, because she knows my work there, and she didn't actually cite that she was arguing against me, but I could feel her kind of looking in my direction, sort of out of the side of her eyes, saying, I don't actually want to have to argue against this. So I'm just going to state, and she says it, I operate from the presumption in italics that Israel means the Jews.
Right.
And then she just moves on. But again, the way that she said it was a way to basically state her priors, which I respect, to state her priors without actually having to engage with any any argument about that.
So, but the bigger question of how do you address this concern for people who do just say, okay, well, if Israel is just Jew and Gentile, and it's people that have been indwelt with the Spirit. Like Paul might just call them, the church, right? I mean, and they would just say, okay, like this is just a different form of the same argument that we've been, we've seen already. And then we will shut it down.
So this is tricky because I think the first thing that needs to be recognized is that when Paul says that some Jews are being cut off for infidelity, and then others from the outside are being grafted in, this is not actually that anomalous. In this respect, he's no more supersessionist than Philo, who talks about Jews being cut off and then proselytes being brought in to be attached to the root and provide new life. So Philo talks about this. This is in On Rewards and Punishment. The Dead Sea Scrolls have numerous places where, their enemies will be swept away. These are other fellow Jews who are going to be swept away for their disobedience. Ezra, Nehemiah. I mean, geez, there are other people there. Sanballat, who's the governor of Samaria, surely regarded himself as an Israelite. They reject this, and they claim preeminence and say, basically, if you're not part of our group, then you're not really a part of this whole thing. Like, that's no less supersessionist. The editors of the Mishnah are no less supersessionist. All Israel will have a place in the world to come,
except
if you're, you follow the Sadducees on this, if you disbelieve in the resurrection, and they give this whole list of exceptions. Like, wait a second, so only all Israel that agrees with your particular stance here is actually going to have a place in the world to come. I think that just makes Paul just like any number of other early Jewish thinkers who believed that disobedient, unfaithful Jews or Israelites, from their perspective, would be cut off and not included in the eschatologically redeemed or restored people of Israel. And for me, this ultimately is actually not really, and one last thing, actually about that on those lines, even the idea of Judaism as the proper heir, or, rabbinic Judaism, getting more specific in that respect, as the proper heir to the legacy of Israel over and against, say, the Samaritans, or over against, other claimants that were available in the Second Temple period, that itself, if this is going to apply to Paul, is going to apply as much to, the fact that the Hebrew Bible is a book about Israel that ultimately becomes the scripture for Jews from Judah. And it's got all this about Israel, that it's the God of Israel that has been adopted by Jews who are part of Israel, but, not the whole, like, okay, at what point is that supersessionist? So I think Paul is a part of a long tradition of arguing that there is a particular way to be the people of the God of Israel, and that his way is the right way. I don't think, if we're going to be good readers of Paul, that we should shy away from that reality. That, that's just, I think, the way he worked. I do think that supersessionism is the wrong terminology for that. I think Paul is a remnant theologian more than he's a supersessionist, because supersessionism more or less requires that you have one group replace another. And I think if you asked Paul, like, so you're saying like the Gentile church is replacing like the Jews as Israel, he'd have been like, are you out of your mind? No, of course not. Gentiles are being grafted into Israel, and Israel includes Jews like me, right? I mean, he says this. He says, I too am in Israel. Like, I'm from Benjamin. Like, God has not forsaken his people whom he foreknew. I'm an Israelite. I'm from Benjamin. So I think he would have said that. Now, that, I think, again, makes him a remnant or sectarian theologian rather than a supersessionist. Where it gets tricky is I think it very quickly becomes supersessionist in practice once the previously mixed. I think in Paul's day, the Jesus movement is still mostly Jewish. Even in Paul's churches, there's Jews. And I think the majority of people who are following Jesus in the 40s and 50s when Paul's doing this stuff are still Jews. And I think a generation later, once it's mostly Gentiles, and Gentiles who've come in largely through Paul's interaction and his influence, I think it becomes supersessionist, because at that point you have a much lower a much smaller percentage of Jews, and ultimately Jews become sort of an other in a way that they aren't really for Paul, in a way that wouldn't even be coherent for Paul. And I think it becomes supersessionist as the composition changes in the next generation. And, there's just no way around that. I think that's just part of the history, but that shouldn't impact or affect the way that we read Paul. I think we have to be faithful readers of him historically before we, get into whether or not the way that this develops in, among his successors is actually the way that it should have developed.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think, again, going back to your answer on the Messiah question, the identity of Israel has always been the same. And I think that is actually the big point for Paul. It's always been about the people who are sons of Abraham in this way, right? They have
and
faith.
Who are faithful to
exactly.
the God of
they
Israel.
They have
Rahab
faith
becomes
like God.
integrated into Israel because she pledges her full allegiance to the God of Israel and gives up all of her gods, and then marries in, and her family becomes part of Israel because of it.
Right. So is God not the God of, the nations also, right? At the end of Romans 3. I mean, seems like it. So that is a good place to stop. I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, but also the book. I mean, I think it's going to be really helpful for people. Any closing thoughts on the book or anything else?
I just cannot wait to finish the indexing so that this is out. I want to, I surely did not get everything right, and I want to see what ultimately people's responses are, and where others can take my arguments forward, and hopefully we can all learn together on this and get a better understanding of what's actually going on in the Pauline epistles, which is really what I'm after.
Well, that's hopefully what we're all after. And again, just really appreciate how careful you are about every text, every word. That's really what needs to be done, and I think you did a great job. So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you, Jason, for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.